Thank you. All right, so thank you all for coming today. It's a beautiful day, and I'm glad that you're here to listen to me talk and about Blandair. And have any of you actually been to the historic side of Blandair? Couple people. Excellent. So I know that they had, back in the early 2000s, they had it open when they were going through planning stages of what to do with the property. But then that group sort of fizzled out, and we are now renewing our preservation initiatives at this site. So a little bit about myself. I am the parks archaeologist. I've been the parks archaeologist with Howard County Rec and Parks for the past 8.5 years. And where I've managed archaeological programming, research, and compliance work within the county's 10,000, I think it's a little over 10,000 acres of county parkland and open space. So my particular background lies in public archaeology and education, and my research interests really are in African American archaeology, so archaeology of slavery, and then archaeology of postbellum, like tenant farming. So I know some of you were here when I talked a year or two ago about my research on a tenant site out in western Howard County. But today I'm here to talk about what I'm currently working on, which is Historic Blandair. And my colleague Keenan could not make it today, but he is also involved in this project. If any of you have met Keenan, he is our new Historic and Cultural Resources Section Manager. Wonderful, wonderful person. So my presentation today focuses on the historic property of Blandair. It's a late 18th through 19th century plantation turned into a 20th century farm. It was an operational farm up until about 1990 when the Smith family, Miss Smith, Elizabeth Smith, sort of let it go. She could no longer farm the property. And it constitutes most of the only open space undeveloped in Columbia. So in the 60s, Jim Rouse and the Rouse Company purchased 14,000 acres of what is now Columbia and developed that. But our 298 acres here that we have right in the middle is undeveloped. So the county acquired the property in 1998 upon the death of its last occupant, Miss Elizabeth Smith, or Nancy Smith. She was a very strong advocate for preservation and fought for several years to keep her property preserved from the development of Columbia by the Rouse Company. So in 1975, the state of Maryland, through eminent domain, took 14 acres of her property, which run right through her property for the continuation of 175. They did pay her a total of $149,008, but she never cashed the check. So she was very, very adamant about saving her property. She passed away in 1997 intestate, so she didn't have a will and she didn't have heirs. So the property then went to two of her cousins who lived out of the area. They didn't want to have anything to do with the inheritance taxes. You know, the inheritance taxes in this county are very high, and they didn't really know how to manage this property, so they sold it to the county for $10.7 million. Since then, the county has operated the land as public park space, developing the south side as a recreational area, playgrounds, sports fields, while the majority of the property, I think it's a little over 100 acres, more than 100 acres. The north side is the well-preserved, intact historical side. So over the past 20 years, both the county and local citizens have planned for preservation and future use of this space. Thanks to a recent grant, we have been able to renew this preservation initiative, and I'll talk about that grant momentarily. So presently, the park in its entirety consists of 298 acres of its original acreage, which is about a little over 300. A 28-acre preservation easement protects the majority of the historic north side. So that means it's a preservation easement with the Maryland Historical Trust, and basically if anything's going to be developed on this property, we have to conduct archaeological research, and mitigation has to be conducted to preserve any intact cultural resources. So nothing bad can happen to this area, ever. So The easement includes the mansion house here. I have a little label here with these labels of what these buildings are. So the main mansion house, which is built in 1858. We have a smokehouse, which we think was built sometime just prior to that. We have the double pen slave quarter, which I'm going to be talking about later. We have a dairy barn. We have the granary, which was built contemporaneously with the slave quarter and the smokehouse. A couple tenant houses, a stone, what we think was the overseer's house, and another horse hay barn. And then this letter I here, you can't really see the structure because of the trees, but there's a spring / possible dairy house that is still standing. So the historic area of Blandair is one of the only intact sites of its kind left in Howard County and has been deemed eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. This was over 20 years ago, so we have to actually go through the process again of renominating it and submitting the application. But it is our goal through our new research and preservation initiatives to complete this National Register process and create a historic space that interprets the county's landscape of a Piedmont plantation, with a particular focus on the history of enslavement and later tenant farming on the property. And I'll explain later why that's going to be at least my focus. All right. As we attempt to interpret the history of the cultural landscape of Blandair, it's imperative to understand the property's historical context. It's important to note that the landscape went through several generations of change prior to the 20th century, and each generation of owners shared differing worldviews on how a plantation should operate and appear. Following the earliest settlement into the westernmost frontier of Anne Arundel County, remember when this land was, during the colonial era, this was still Anne Arundel County. Howard County didn't become a county until 1851, so you have over 100 years of this being part of Anne Arundel County. Blandair, for at least 200 years, was an operational plantation, one of many throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The families of Blandair were included among the prominent planter families of the region, such as the Carrolls, the Dorseys, the Hammonds, Howards, and Warfields. And two of those families are associated with Blandair property, as I will talk about shortly. Many people don't realize that Howard County had plantations, as many perceptions of plantation life is influenced by movies like Gone with the Wind or the stately presidential homes in Virginia. But Howard County did indeed have a well-established plantation system. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, several large plantations were established, and there's just some pictures of a number of these. We have Woodlawn. I always forget which one this is. Oakland Mills, Oakdale, Belmont, and then, of course, Doe Regan. And so these plantations were established, but they were also surrounded by, many more small family farms. What differentiates a plantation from a farm? Howard County did not spend much time cultivating tobacco, nor did they rely on other cash crops such as cotton, rice, indigo, or sugar. How were these sites considered plantations? So this is I wanted to sort of highlight the difference between the two. Plantations were large in scale. They often resembled their own little communities, their own little villages. You think of the main house and then all the slave quarters, all of the barns, all of the granaries, all the ancillary buildings that were associated with it. The family farms were small in scale. Plantations focused on one cash crop monoculture. It's different in Howard County, but this general definition of a plantation is focusing on one cash crop, whereas farms focused on a variety of crops and often had livestock. Plantations relied on enslaved and forced labor. Smaller family farms were managed by the landowners and typically their family members. A lot of the smaller family farms in Howard County did have maybe one or two enslaved laborers, but not a lot. Plantations were for commercial profit, while small farms were for subsistence of the family. national plantations sent to national and international export, where farms were for local markets. And then plantations are often associated with high socioeconomic status, whereas small family farms were middling or poor farmers. So that's just the difference when we're talking about what Blandair is. And we define Blandair as a plantation. So little research has been conducted on the archaeology of history of plantations in the Piedmont region of Maryland. Blandair serves as an excellent resource to provide significant contextual data to enrich this history throughout the state and the county. So this is just a map showing there's the coastal plain and then there's the Piedmont. So all these counties were in the Piedmont Plateau, Piedmont region. So all the plantations that you find along the Chesapeake Bay primarily grew tobacco. The soil was fertile enough to cultivate tobacco, whereas once you reach the fall line and get into the Piedmont, the soil is too rocky and acidic for tobacco. So farmers quickly learned that tobacco wasn't going to prosper in this region, so they quickly switched to cereal grains and corn. So the plantations in the Piedmont were largely cereal grain plantations. They also had, because of their smaller size and cereal grains weren't as labor intensive, they also adapted orchards. They adapted a lot of plantations adapted apiaries, bee farms, dairies, and other small industries on their farm. They were able to have the time to do that. So Blandair was originally part of the 3 land patents granted in the first quarter of the 18th century. Our particular study on the north side falls completely within the bounds of Talbot's Resolution Manor, which was granted in 1714 to John Talbot for a total of 1,087 acres. The southern portion was part of Bell's Chance, Henry Ridgely, and addition to New Year's Gift, which was Caleb and Edward Dorsey. It's unclear if John Talbot and his wife lived on the property after his acquisition, but most likely it was acquired for land speculation only, as the Talbots did have a manor on the West River in Anne Arundel County at that time. And a lot of this land, when it was patented, was just for land speculation, as early as 1714. So I'm going to go through the historical narrative. It's really important to understand the historical story of the property to understand how the cultural landscape changed over time. So I've divided up into different eras, the different landowner eras. So the first era, in 1747, 200 acres of Talbot's Resolution Manor was given to Edward Dorsey, adjacent to the Dorsey property, Linden Grove. I don't know if you all know where Linden Grove is. It's across from where we are at Blandair, off Tamar Drive. If you go down Carriage House Lane, it's an old house that sits back in the middle of the neighborhood. But that was a Dorsey property. And so at this point, it's still unclear as to the use or occupancy of Blandair property. Edward Dorsey himself was living, keep pushing on, at Howard Lodge out in Sykesville. In 1768, land is passed to Colonel Thomas Dorsey of Troy. So this is an image of Troy, which is over in Elkridge. Again, it's unclear if anyone occupied this land during the colonial period. Future archaeology will help us identify the colonial landscape if anybody was working that property. So our next era is the Howard era. So in 1768 deed notes Thomas Dorsey selling Dr. Ephraim Howard 252 acres of Talbot's Resolution Manor, parts of Bell's Chance, in addition to New Year's Gift, for a total of 380 pounds. No specific improvements were noted in that deed, which is also justified by the price of the property. It's pretty low. And we know that Dr. Howard lived on another property called Mount Etna, which is close to present-day Ellicott City. We do have some evidence about the occupation of this property. 1783 Maryland tax assessment lists Ephraim Howard, and Talbot's resolution, part of 256 acres, 4 white inhabitants, no slaves, 1 horse, valued at 14 pounds. So we know that at least 4 white inhabitants were living and working on the property at this time. We don't know what kind of structure they lived in. We don't know if there were any other outbuildings associated. We won't know this until we do more archaeology. These are most likely tenant farmers who could very well have been living on the property during the colonial era. I am finding some artifacts that date to the earlier colonial period, such as ceramics, so it's very possible that we just haven't found their house yet. So Ephraim Howard died in 1788, but it took 10 years for his estate to be settled. This is the 1794 Griffiths map of Maryland, and it depicts Howard. And then this is where Linden Grove is. So we see Howard here is still listed as owner, even though he had passed away. This shows that there was a structure here, although we don't know what type, how many structures or what size structures. So in 1798, there was a public sale in which Joshua Howard, who was Ephraim's brother, purchased the property for 912 pounds. So that evaluation is more suggesting that there was, some kind of improvement made on the property by 1798. In this deed, in this public sale, it does mention a dwelling plantation, and it suggests this was probably a functioning plantation by the late 18th century. Although it was not Howard's main estate. While Joshua Howard owned the property in 1798 legally, economically, he is not the one living on the land. The 1798 federal tax assessment for Elkridge 100 lists John Crompton Weems as the occupant or possessor. He is most likely leasing the property around 1798, but we do know that he purchased the property outright in 1804. So this 1798 federal tax assessment gives us a lot of information about the property. So this is all specific to our area. It lists a dwelling house and 2 acres entry. So we know that these structures that are listed here were all located within a 2-acre perimeter of the dwelling house. So that helps me as an archaeologist. If I can find the main dwelling house that stood, then I can kind of figure to look within those first 2 acres. But at this dwelling house, part of Talbot's Resolution Manor, 1 brick dwelling house, 1 old stone house, 1 old stone kitchen, 1 brick smokehouse, 1 brick dairy, valuation $500. Now, Weems was likely the first owner to reside himself on the property. The previous owners were absentee landowners. And we think that he was probably the one who built the brick dwelling house. And the use of brick showed a change in socioeconomic status, tenant to owner, and also a greater investment in capital and labor. So if he's going to be living on this property, he's going to be building a better house for him and his family. There's no reference to an old stone kitchen, or there's reference to an old stone kitchen, but not a new one. So we don't know if a new kitchen was added into the brick dwelling house or if they continued to use the old stone kitchen. And this is important for us archaeologists because do we look for another structure, another house with a kitchen inside of it, or do we look for this old stone kitchen? There is no reference to slave quarters at this time. They likely used the space inside the old stone house and the stone kitchen for living quarters for their workers. So in 1825, John Crompton Weems, so he was actually a member of the U.S. Congress between 1826 and 1829. He had his familial estate in Anne Arundel County called Loch Eden. So this was his sort of secondary home. And in 1825, he mortgaged the property to Robert Miller for $5,080 because he needed capital for his political career. So basically, he borrowed this money to buy a house in D.C. to live in while he was in Congress, and then he came back in 1829. So it was just temporary we don't know if Robert Miller lived in the house at that time or what. But what do we know about Weems' occupation at Blandair? Very little. But we're fortunate enough to have a journal from a neighboring planter, George Cook, who his plantation was called Hazelwood, and it does mention Weems several times. And a funny story with Weems is he was very cantankerous, especially when it came to his property boundaries. So his property was adjacent to Colonel Thomas Dorsey, or was it John Dorsey at this time? But Dorsey had, I think, 16 acres of Weems' property, and Weems had 4 acres of Dorsey's property. So they were butting heads. So Weems challenged Dorsey to a duel. But he insisted on having the traditional pistols that were traditionally used in England for duels, but they couldn't find any in America. So Dorsey had to go to Liverpool to acquire the set of dueling pistols. And when he came back, Weems had gone. He had left the property. So no duel ensued, but there's many mentions of how Weems complained about his property boundaries. What we can tell about Weems is this is the 1820 federal census for District 4. And it lists, it's really hard to see, but John C. Weems here, George Cook, and then John T. Dorsey, or W. Dorsey. So we know that this is our property here. And it lists Weems as having 10 white inhabitants and 16 enslaved laborers at this property, Blandair. And so this is the first definitive evidence we have documented. Whoops. Okay. At the property. They possibly lived there in some number when he moved onto the property in 1798 and when he purchased the property in 1804. But this is the first actual enumeration of enslaved laborers on the property. The 1830 census also lists Weems with 12 white and 10 enslaved. So, I don't want to move that. What does this information tell us as we investigate Blandair? It tells us that at least the second generation landscape was much different than the one we see presently. While we research the present-day landscape, we have to keep this in mind. So, for example, how did the enslaved landscape change from the colonial period through the late antebellum period into the postbellum? So, we have the first occupation, our first generation landscape, which were the tenant workers when the Howards and the Dorseys owned the property. The second generation when the Weems owned it, and then we'll talk about the next generation. So Weems era part 2. Now, when John Crompton Weems was ready, he retired to his family estate in Anne Arundel County and sold Blandair, well, what was called LaGrange back then, to his daughter-in-law Martha P. and his son John Webster Weems. These two were probably not well suited to be farmers. And that was almost circumstantial because of what was happening at the time. They kind of ran the plantation into the ground. But that was because in 1834, the Bank of Maryland failed. So a lot of farmers lost their assets. And then in 1836, there were crop failures due to severe weather volatility. These conditions resulted in failed corn harvests and poor grain yields, causing a significant economic stress to farmers and landowners. And then in 1837 to 1839, all resulted in a statewide Great Depression. So the Weems were apparently greatly impacted by these events. In 1836, we know John Weems applied for a second mortgage with the American Life Insurance and Trust Company of Baltimore for $3,500. But there's no evidence that he used this money to improve his farm during this time. We don't know what he did with the money. Conditions at LaGrange, Blandair, could be imagined from a description from George Cook's diary in 1837. So this is from the 4th of May, 1837. Raining off and on all day. Brought 2 barrels of damaged corn from Mr. Weems. the rats were destroying it and the roof leaking. So later the next owner just mentions how it's not in great condition. So in 1842, the American Life Insurance and Trust went bankrupt, and Weems was unable to pay his mortgage. So he had to sell his property in 1843. And so they owned the land for about 10 years. We don't know if they made any improvements, as I had said. It's unclear if any improvements were made, but the beginning of the next era further describes the destitute nature of the property by the mid-19th century, which is what we call the Bland era. And this is what Blandair is named after. So Theodoric Bland was a member of the House of Delegates in 1809, associate judge of the 6th Judicial District, commissioner to South America, and appointed to the U.S. District Court of Maryland in 1819, until his appointment as chancellor to the state in 1824. So he went through all these positions well before he purchased Blandair. Upon point of sale, Weems was asking for $8,500 for this property. But Bland, however, writing to his lawyer in 1844, described the property as, "It was not until after I had seen Mr. Weems' farm and had considered the cost of repairing the dwelling house, which is but a shell, and of putting upon the land such new edifices as would be indispensably necessary, of which there are none. That is a Negro quarter and stables, etc." So we believe that some of these structures that he mentioned, the slave quarters and the granary, and he also added a smokehouse, we believe, next to the kitchen eventually for the house that was built in 1858. Prior to archaeological work, it was believed that the extant granary, slave quarter, and smokehouse were constructed right around this time. Bland used this property as a summer retreat. We don't know how often he actually was on the property, but it was most likely operated by farm managers or caretakers. And the brick house was for the family, while the stone house that was on my earlier map was likely for the farm manager. There's no list of specific enslaved laborers at this time, but the 1840 census for Theodoric Bland lists him with 7 enslaved laborers. Having an overseer, as well as calling for the need for a slave quarter, suggests that he most likely had an enslaved labor force during his brief occupation. And I will say that he is the shortest occupant, only a year. He died in 1846. So as I said, he probably spent very little time out here. The next era is the Mayo era, and this is associated with Captain Isaac Mayo of the U.S. Navy. So upon his death, Bland left Blandair along with his 11 enslaved laborers. We know from historic documentation he left 11 people to his daughter Sarah Bland Mayo, wife of Captain Isaac Mayo. Sarah Mayo lived part-time at Blandair while her husband commanded the African squadron at sea. They also had another plantation in Anne Arundel County and also a house in Annapolis. So not much is known about Mayo's specific influence on Blandair during this residency, but historical documentation tells us some important information. So we have 2 separate census records here. We have the 1850 slave schedule for Howard County, which enumerated all the enslaved laborers that landowners had, if you were a slaveholder. And then we have the regular 1850 federal census. So the 1850 federal census does not list Mayo as an occupant at this site. And the way I was able to deduce that, there's a Hetty C. Graham, and then there's another name under it that's not Isaac Mayo. However, the slave schedule, there's Hetty C. Graham, and then there's Mary Dorsey, and there's Isaac Mayo. He has 15 enslaved laborers. The 50 census lists a Joshua T. Young as overseer. So because Isaac Mayo, this was not his primary residence, he had John Young as overseer, managing the property at this time, while he had 15 enslaved laborers at this property. So there were enslaved laborers at 1850, and there was an overseer. And we do think that the slave quarter that we're working on was built by 1850. So they were most likely living in this quarter, or one of the quarters, wherever that was. All right. The next era was the Gaither era. And this represents the third generation of cultural landscape, which is a portion of what we see today. The present mansion house was constructed by 1858 by Sophia Gaither, which was the Mayo's daughter, and her husband Thomas H. Gaither. So you can see them depicted on the 1860 Martinet map here. There's Linden Hall, there's Blandair. The 1860 census lists, which is on the right-hand side, lists Thomas Gaither. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is the slave schedule. So the 1860 census lists Thomas and Sophia, as well as John Smallwood, who was farm manager, most likely living in the farm manager's house. The 1860 slave schedule lists Thomas H. Gaither. He has 20 enslaved laborers at this time. So, and I will say that the Gaithers were the first family to live full-time at this plantation. So they lived here, they had a farm manager, and they had 20 enslaved laborers. The interesting thing about this document is that there's the column at the end lists it says number of slave houses. Thomas Gaither has 2. We know there was one that's still standing, but we don't know where the second one was. So that's another thing that I'm interested in as an archaeologist, is looking for that second quarter. So the Gaithers were the last owners during the antebellum period. They owned the property up through the end of the Civil War, and they sold it in 1867. And they moved to a different farm in Howard County. And I'm going to talk about one family post-emancipation because they're kind of significant to the people who lived and worked on this property. That's the Burwell era. So Charles Burwell, and if you come for a tour, he actually has his name graffitied up in the attic, which is interesting. They sold their plantation to Charles Burwell. He was actually a planter from Virginia. His family estate was in Roanoke, Virginia, but he was the youngest son, so he wasn't going to inherit the family farm. So he purchased this property in Maryland and lived until 1876. I do want to point out, and this is from the 1878 Hopkins Atlas, so you can see him here. Even though he was gone by then, he's still listed as the owner. Because they were going through, the next owners were the Brosines, and they were going through some family issues with selling the property, getting the property. But the 1870 census is interesting because Burwell actually brought with him a number of farm laborers from his family farm in Virginia. So I don't even know how many farm laboring families, but they had to have lived somewhere on the property. So where are these tenant houses? And then another interesting thing was he also employed former enslaved laborers from the Gaithers. At least one family, Moses Smith and Lavinia Smith, or Lavinia Smith, however it's spelled in different documents. But they continued to live on the property, at least through 1880. And she's going to come up again, Miss Smith. So I want to end my historical narrative here, as this is where we'll stop our main interpretation. When we do interpretation, we're going to focus on the 1850s, 1860s occupation of the farm. Before I finish, I want to focus on a few snapshots of the African American history that we know about this property. We are lucky to have some information on the enslaved and free laborers. As I mentioned, the first definitive appearance that there were enslaved laborers was in 1820, possibly there by 1804. The presence of enslaved laborers shaped much of the landscape of Blandair, particularly with the absentee landowners. And we're lucky to have a few pieces of historical documentation that tells us some of these stories. So the first one is a runaway slave ad from October 19th, 1849. And this is for, Isaac Mayo posted this in the Baltimore Sun, looking for a bright mulatto Negro woman named Matilda and her, I always forget if it's 5 or 6 children, 5 children. So Matilda, we believe, was the cook for the Mayos at Blandair. And one evening, her husband, Richard Neal, so her last name is Neal, he was a freedman. He worked on another one of Isaac Mayo's other plantation in Anne Arundel County. He came in the middle of the night and got Matilda and her 5 children, and they escaped to Philadelphia, where they lived out the rest of their life in freedom. So this is just the advertisement that Isaac Mayo put up. So we know a little bit, we know what happened to this family, so we can interpret, we can talk about the Underground Railroad, we can talk about how, freedom seekers, and we know the results of what happened with this family. So we can tell that story. This is just a record of a court case where Richard Neal was actually being charged for helping his wife escape, which he was never caught. So they were able to live successfully in freedom in Philadelphia, where they actually, they lived the rest of their lives in Philadelphia. And the interesting thing about this is it does mention one other enslaved laborer, William Hunter. He actually basically tattletaled on Richard Neal, and he told Isaac Mayo what happened. So Isaac Mayo was able to try to get Richard in court, but was not successful. The other interesting story is our Mrs. Lavina Smith, or generally called Vina. So this is the wife of Moses, who continued to work on the property. She escaped in May of 1859, and Thomas Gaither had put out an ad for her return. The interesting thing, we don't know why she ran. We don't know where she went. And we don't know when she returned. But by 1870, she was back with her family. And it was just her who sought freedom. It wasn't the rest of her family. But we know by 1870, they were back and living on the property. And, she lived out the rest of her life on the property. So we know a little bit about this. And I'm not sure, but 1870, since they were enslaved and then they continued to live on the property, I don't know if they were one of the families who lived in our standing slave quarter, but the more research we do, we might be able to figure that out. And we look at the artifacts as well to kind of match up. You can't really see it, but in 1868, when after slavery, landowners basically petitioned to the state of Maryland to be reimbursed for the property that they lost, property being human chattel. And they didn't get reimbursed, but this document is very helpful for us because it lists all 20 enslaved laborers that Thomas Gaither had on his property during his occupation, first and last names. So we have the Smiths. We have all the names. So we can actually go through and trace what happened to all of these families. And there were 20 people, but there were maybe 3 or 4 families living together. So, and we know that our slave quarter at the time, it was a double pen, meant that it was 2 sides, 2 living apartments with lofts. And then after emancipation, the structure was for one family where they took down partitions and one family lived in the building, 1 or 2 families. But I just think it's interesting. I want to know the story of the Smith family. And, everybody else left, but why did they stay? All right, so I got my notes here are a little mixed up. Anyway, I don't need my notes now. So in 2024, Howard County Rec and Parks and the Office of Planning and Zoning applied for an African American Historic Preservation Program grant because we saw the need to start giving attention to some of these structures on the property of Blandair. We had been given money to restore the mansion house, but we're like, all right, what are our priorities? Our priorities really need to be first the slave quarter before it falls apart. The house is in pretty good shape. The granary was in rough shape, so we shored that building up. And now our focus is on the slave quarter. So we received $250,000 to preserve this structure. And that includes, rehabbing it, preserving it. We're going to preserve it to like 1850s, 1860s time period, what it would have originally looked like. So if you haven't been inside, it's two sides. And there was a wooden plank floor that was put down sometime, I think, in the 1950s by a previous tenant. We actually removed that floor because we're going to do archaeology inside the quarter, because we want to know what the original flooring was like. We want to look for features such as subfloor pits, where people would have hidden their personal objects that maybe tell us about the families who lived in there. And then we'll eventually, interpret the space, and all the artifacts that we find, we're going to create displays inside the mansion house. So this will be a fully interpreted space, for education and for visitors, for tours, So we're really happy with this grant. So what I've been doing since then, since we received the grant, is I've been doing some archaeology around the slave quarter, because we want to know information before we interpret. We want to know more for what to interpret. So archaeology really, they did some early archaeology back in 2007 around the main house when they were putting in a water pipeline and when they were putting in the sewage line. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to focus on what I've done. So in 2024, we went out and the county bought me a ground penetrating radar machine. And if you don't know what that is, it looks like a push mower and it looks underground. It sends signals underneath the ground and it bounces off whatever it hits. And it gives us images that we have to interpret. They're not always easy to interpret, but I laid out 4 grids. We were looking for a second slave quarter. So I was like, okay, here's our first slave quarter. It's got to be somewhere in the vicinity if it was the same type of slave quarter. Didn't really find a whole lot in the grids that we established. This area up here, I'm going to be surveying. There is a structure up here, I think. I did another survey up here with some of my adult students, but we didn't calibrate the machine correctly, so the results were a little skewed, but there is something up here. So we found this feature. You can see how it's sort of white and linear up here. And if you overlay historic maps, historical aerials, it's actually an old historic road. So we did shovel tests and we hit solid rock underneath. And so it was the old road, old driveway. Didn't find much except for artifact scatters here and there. There's a cluster of stuff here that could be impacted dirt, the continuation of the driveway, but didn't find anything that looked like a building. So we hope to we'll do more survey work in this area and out here just to see. So from the ground penetrating radar survey, we did shovel testing survey. And if you've never done archaeology before, it's where we basically dig a hole I think we did 20 meters to look for clusters, distributions of artifacts to kind of pinpoint down where a feature may be. So I laid it out in 2 grids. I looked at the north area north of the slave quarter and to the south of the slave quarter, because odds were that this is where the second quarter would be. And you can see from this map, we delineate between negative shovel tests and positive shovel tests. Positive means that we found artifacts. Negative means we found nothing. All these solid dots are positive. We found positive shovel tests in most of them, except for a couple over here. And so there's definitely a boundary between the yard area and the agricultural field. So we're able to use GIS to pinpoint clusters of artifacts. So what I did was I went in my catalog and I picked out all of the artifacts associated with architecture. So brick, nail, window glass, plaster and mortar. And these are the two areas for architectural. We have obvious architectural distribution around the slave quarter. But then we have some up in this area. And then this is just to the south. We have a heavy presence in this area and sort of further down, just south of the standing slave quarter. So that tells us that there's probably something underneath the ground there. And this was the area of that highly dense area of artifacts. There was a black walnut tree, which is no longer standing because it's sitting literally on top of the building that we found. And all the stilt grass is gone. So this is all excavated now, but this was the area where we found a lot. So I wanted to show this. When we do shovel tests, we look at the profile of soil. So basically you're looking at the different levels of soils if you're looking straight on. And so there was the top level, which is just the organic, humus. And then in one of them, we have all across the site, we have this strange clay lens that I think they just kind of put fill down in certain places around the site. But then we hit this deep layer of soil mixed with a lot of architectural debris. So this was other evidence that there was something there. And this is just a photograph of what that would have looked like when we excavated the unit. So you can see all this debris sitting on top of a foundation. So basically what all this stuff is they knocked the building down and they knocked it into the building itself. And there's a lot of trash in here from, I would say, 1880 to about 1920. So they used that particular area as a trash pit from during that time period. And then this is the building we found. Not quite sure what it is. It's about 7 feet by 7 feet. It's very small. At first, I just found the one side. I was like, oh, we found the second quarter. It's too small for a quarter from what we know of as of now. We have to actually remove that big stump because the stump is literally sitting right on top to see if that building extends a different way. But the interesting thing was the level of soil above. This is basically the base of it, the floor, the main floor. It's very compact clay, has some burn spots on it. But the level above that was a very soft, silty dirt with thousands and thousands of cut nails, and a lot of animal bones, burnt oyster shell, and eggshell. So it was very well preserved. So when we analyze what this building could be, once we finish excavating, we'll take all that information into account to try to figure out, was it a smokehouse? Because there was evidence of burning on the floor. There doesn't seem to be a hearth. So I don't know if it was one of the earlier smokehouses. So my last slide here, I just want to talk about future programming and interpretation at Blandair. All right, so we received this grant, this $250,000 grant for the slave quarter, and we have money to work on restoring the main house. What we're planning on doing with the main house is we're going to have the bottom level classroom space, exhibit space, and the second floor are going to be offices. I'm hoping to have my main office out here and make this like the archaeology center of Howard County. But we really plan on having this property interpreted and available to use as a living history experiential site where people can come out and learn about the history of slavery, the history of tenant farming, the history of agriculture, and of Howard County, and really get a fully immersive experience out here. We do want to interpret it to its 1850, 1860 time period. And a lot of our focus is going to be on the workers of the property, because for most of its history, they were absentee landowners. I mean, we'll talk about them, but we really want to focus on the people who were there 24/7 and really knew the property. So it's really exciting. And, my interest in education, we're really going to be working with K through 12 to have this as a sort of a laboratory space for kids to come out and learn about history, learn about, agricultural history, learn about environment of the time. So another era of history that I did not mention was the indigenous history of the site. There were indigenous peoples who occupied the site before Europeans came. We are finding artifacts associated with that. The Susquehannock and the Piscataway peoples did come into Howard County to use this space for resource procurement, hunting. They camped here. So during our survey work, we will most likely find indigenous sites on the property. So we are going to interpret that, how they use that space as well. So I think I'm just this was Keenan's part. I'm just trying to remember everything that he had said before. I'm trying to talk our park planner into taking the dairy barn and creating an interactive archaeology lab, but funding, the county has no money, and so we have to really rely on grants for this. So all of you, if you're supportive of this project, go to your county, council members and, say how important the site is and give us money and, and staff. Because Keenan and I are the only full-time staff within historical and cultural resources. We have other part-time contingent staff, but I am the only one doing the archaeology, and it's a lot of work. So I depend on my volunteers a lot. So if you are interested in coming out and volunteering, I know Ann and I are going to work on coming up with some public dig days for the Historical Society to come out for some field trips and come out and help and get your hands dirty and find history. So I just wanted my last slide. This was some of my volunteers. I work closely with Towson University, their Department of Anthropology. So I get a lot of their students during the summer. So this was last summer. And just a special thank you to the different groups who have helped us out.
Thank you. Yep.
That is all. Yeah, you're free to come up and look at the artifacts and take my card if you have any additional questions. But thank you all so much for coming out.